I want to tell you about bread. Not bread as a concept, not bread as the staff of life, not the metaphor, not the symbol. Bread as the specific thing that Goldstein makes on West 54th Street every morning beginning at 4 o'clock, and what it takes to make it, and what knowing what it takes does to the simple act of buying a loaf on a Tuesday morning. I have been buying bread from Goldstein for 3 years. Not every day. I am not a bread every day person. I eat what is available, and I eat at restaurants, and I eat the sardines I described in a different context, and which I will describe again at the end of this series in more detail than you may want. But regularly. Twice a week, perhaps. Sometimes more if the week has been good enough to deserve more bread. 3 years of Tuesday bread. And last week, I asked Goldstein if I could watch. He said yes. He didn't ask why. He didn't say, "Come any time." He said, "Tuesday, 4 in the morning. The door will be unlocked." And he went back to whatever he was doing, and that was the conversation. I set my alarm for 3:30. West 54th Street at 3:50 in the morning is a different street from West 54th Street at 9 in the morning when I walk to Manny's. I knew this in the abstract way of knowing things about a street you live on, but have not been on at this hour. I know the abstract because the city is always doing something at every hour, because New York is a city that does not stop, because the specific sounds and characters of the city's various nighttime hours are knowable even to someone who is usually asleep during them. The specific, I did not know. The specific at 3:50 in the morning on West 54th Street, the cold. Not winter cold, October cold. The specific cold of a city street at 4 in the morning when the concrete has given up the heat it absorbed during the day and before the sun has begun to restore it. A cold that is more complete than the afternoon cold of the same temperature because it is uncontested. Nothing warm nearby, just the air and the stone. And the specific quiet. The quiet. Not silence. New York is never silent. The transit system runs, the trucks make their early deliveries. The specific low frequency of the city's mechanical infrastructure is always audible if you listen for it. But the human quiet. The voices gone. The specific sounds of people moving through space, which are constant from 7 in the morning to midnight, absent at 4. The smell. I could smell Goldstein's from the corner. Not a faint bakery smell, the full smell, the bread smell at its most active, the specific warm complex of yeast and heat and flour, and the something that is not any of these things that the combination produces when it is working at full intensity. The smell that at 9 in the morning is the background of the block, pleasant, familiar. The smell I walk past without stopping, at 4 in the morning, with no other smells competing. The whole street smelled like Goldstein's bread. I stopped at the corner and stood in it for a moment. Then I walked to the door, which was unlocked as promised. The bakery at 4 in the morning is Goldstein and one other person. The other person? His nephew, 18 years old, who has been working at the bakery since he was 12, and who does not speak much, and who moves through the space with the specific fluid efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything is and has known for 6 years. The nephew's name is Moshe. He looked at me when I came in, nodded once, went back to what he was doing. Goldstein looked up from a large wooden table covered in flour. He said, "You're here." I said, "I'm here." He said, "Wash your hands. There." He indicated a sink in the corner with a tilt of his head. I washed my hands. I stood by the wall and watched. The bakery at 4 in the morning. Hot, not uncomfortably hot. The specific warmth of a space with an oven running at temperature, a warmth that is the opposite of the street outside, that lands on the skin as comfort after the October cold. loud in a specific way. Not the loud of voices or traffic, the loud of process, the mechanical sound of the mixer when Morsha uses it, the specific sound of dough being worked against the table, the sound of the oven when its door opens and closes. Smelling of everything. I have described the bread smell from the street. From inside the bakery, the smell is more complex. Not more intense exactly, more layered. The specific smell of flour alone before it becomes anything. The specific smell of yeast, which is a live thing and smells like a live thing. Slightly sour, slightly sweet. The smell of something actively doing what it does. The butter. The heat of the oven itself, which has its own smell. And underneath all of it, the bread. Already baking. The first batches in before I arrived. The loaves that would be done by 5 and cooling on the rack by the time I had been there an hour. I want to describe the process of making bread because the describing is the point of this episode. And because I had watched it begin to some extent in homes, seen photographs in books, understood it conceptually, and had not understood it at all until I watched Goldstein. The ingredients: flour, water, salt, yeast. 4 things. This is bread. The specific miracle of bread is that these 4 things, combined in the right proportions and worked in the right ways at the right temperatures for the right amounts of time, become something that is profoundly more than the 4 things. This is not alchemy. I know the chemistry exists. The specific biological and chemical processes by which yeast consumes sugars and produces carbon dioxide that inflates the gluten network of the flour, and the heat of the oven sets the structure and the steam caramelizes the crust. I know the chemistry. I did not know the bread. Watching Goldstein. The flour arrives from a sack, not a small sack, an enormous one, the sack of someone for whom flour is purchased in quantities that represent daily use. Goldstein has been making this bread for 22 years. He goes through flour the way the city goes through everything, continuously, in quantities that would stagger the occasional user. He measures, not with cups or measuring spoons, with his hands and with his eye. He has made this bread so many times that the measurement lives in his hands. The right amount of flour goes into the bowl by feel. The yeast. He described it to me while he worked, in the specific way of someone explaining something they understand completely to someone who doesn't. You have to be good to it. It's alive. You treat it wrong, it dies. The bread doesn't rise. You have flour and water and salt and nothing. The yeast is alive. He said this without drama, as a fact, the same way you say a cat or a dog is alive. The yeast in the bakery is a living organism, and Goldstein treats it accordingly. The water must be warm, not hot. Hot kills the yeast. Not cold. Cold slows it. The rise takes too long. The bread develops wrong. Warm. The specific warm that a living thing can work in. The mixing machine exists. Moshe uses it for some things. But the bread? The specific rye bread that I buy on Tuesdays, the bread that Goldstein says I want before I ask, that bread Goldstein makes by hand. I want to describe the hands, because the hands are the content of this episode, in the way that the wave front and the wire on the bridge were the content of the episodes that held them. Goldstein's hands are 63 years old. He was born in Lodz, Poland in 1885, and he came to New York in 1921, and he has been making bread since he was 9 years old, and the hands have been making bread for 54 years. They show this, not as damage, as accumulation. The specific thickening of the palms and the fingers that comes from decades of working with dough, from the friction of flour and the pressure of kneading, from the heat of ovens over decades. But the showing is in the movement more than the appearance. He worked the dough, and the movement was— I want to find the right word. The word that describes the specific quality of someone doing something they have done 10,000 times, where the knowledge has gone so deep into the body that the body does it without the mind managing it. Not automatic. Automatic is what you do without attention. What Goldstein does is with attention. I could see the attention in his face, the specific quality of someone who is checking as they go, who is reading the dough through their hands, who is receiving information from the material and adjusting what they're doing based on the information. But the adjusting is below the verbal, below the level of saying, "The dough is slightly wet today because the flour absorbed moisture from the air, so I'll add a little more." The knowledge is in the hands, and the hands adjust, and the mind registers the adjusting without managing it. This is what 22 years of the same bread produces. The hands know the bread. Goldstein is not a talkative man in the way of men who perform their stories for an audience. He told me things while he worked, in the specific way of someone whose talking is secondary to their working. Fragments, offered when they arrived, not arranged for effect. He told me he was born in Woods. His father was a baker. His father's father was a baker. He is the third generation. He learned from his father, who learned from his father, who— he gestured with a dough-covered hand— had been making bread for as long as anyone could remember. He told me, when he came to New York in 1921, he brought nothing. The bread is not nothing. He said this specifically. The bread he makes is not a recipe he brought. It is a knowledge he brought. The recipe could be written down, and is, in a notebook in the back of the bakery, in Yiddish, in his father's handwriting. But the recipe is not the bread. The bread is what happens when the recipe is combined with 54 years of hands. He told me, the bread in America is not the bread in Łódź. The flour is different. The water is different. The ovens are different. He spent the first 3 years in New York making bread that was not quite right. Not bad, but not the bread he was trying to make. Not the bread he grew up with. Not the bread that was in his hands. He made it work, eventually. The knowledge adjusted. The bread became itself here. Bread always becomes a little of the place it's made in, he said. That's not wrong. That's what bread does. He told me, when he first opened the shop on West 54th in 1926, the neighborhood was different, more Jewish. Now, mixed, changing. The customers have changed, but the bread has not changed. The bread is the same bread. The people eating it are different people. That's fine. Bread doesn't care who eats it. There is a point in bread making where you have done what you can do. The dough is made. It is shaped. It is placed in the bowl or on the tray, covered with cloth, set in the specific warm place that Goldstein has near the oven, where the temperature is consistent and the air doesn't move much. And then, you wait. Not a short wait. The first rise takes an hour or more. During this hour, the yeast does what yeast does, producing the carbon dioxide that inflates the gluten network, making the dough grow, producing the specific sour yeasty smell that is different from the bread smell because it is the raw material doing its work, not the finished thing. Goldstein and Moshe during the rising, they work on other things. There are other breads at different stages of the process. Goldstein is always managing multiple loaves, multiple batches, each at a different point in the long process of flour to bread. But there is a quality of the waiting that is specific and that I noticed. Goldstein checks the dough, not continuously, but regularly. He passes by, he looks at it, he touches it with a finger, he assesses. The assessing is not anxious. It is the specific attentiveness of someone who has ceded control to a process, and who is monitoring rather than managing. He cannot make the bread rise faster. He cannot make it rise more than it is going to rise. He has done what he can do, and now the yeast is doing what it does, and his job is to be present and attentive, and ready for the next moment when his actions are required. This is patience in the literal sense, not the virtue of endurance, the specific skill of knowing when to act and when to wait, and trusting the process during the wait. I have been thinking about this since 4 in the morning. The best performances I have given have had this quality. The moment before I go on stage, when everything I can do in preparation has been done, and what remains is to be present and attentive, and trust what I have prepared to be there when the moment requires it. Bread and acting, the same patience. The waiting is the work. At some point, I had been there 2 hours, it was close to 6, Goldstein moved the first batch into the oven. The oven in a serious bakery is not the oven in a kitchen. It is larger, obviously, but the more significant difference is the heat. The sustained, even, serious heat that a bakery oven maintains, and that a domestic oven achieves only imperfectly. The temperature that transforms the risen dough into the specific thing that bread is. He put the loaves in with a specific tool, a long-handled flat paddle called a peel, the specific instrument of the baker's trade, sliding each loaf from the tray to the oven floor with the practiced efficiency of the 10,000th time. The oven closed. I watched the clock. Goldstein did not watch the clock. He does not need to. The bread is done when it is done, which he knows by smell, by color, by the specific sound the loaf makes when you tap it on the bottom. A hollow sound means the inside is cooked. A dense sound means more time. I asked him how he knows. He thought about this. He said, "I smell it. When the bread smells ready, it's almost ready. When it's almost done smelling ready, it's done." This is not a usable instruction. This is knowledge. The difference between a usable instruction and knowledge is the difference between the recipe in the notebook and the hands that have made the bread 10,000 times. The recipe tells you when the oven should be. The knowledge tells you when the bread is done. At 6:15, the first loaves came out of the oven. Goldstein set them on the cooling rack. The smell. I have described the smell from outside, from around the corner, from inside the bakery before the baking. Nothing prepared me for the smell of the bread coming out of the oven. It is not the same smell. The bread baking smell is the in-process smell, the smell of transformation in progress. The bread from the oven smell is the completed smell. The bread done, its crust caramelized to the specific brown that Goldstein aimed for. The steam rising from the interior, the complex of all the chemical processes that baking involves, exhaling as heat and vapor, and the specific smell that means, this is bread. The smell at 6:15 in the morning in Goldstein's bakery, the first loaves of the day on the rack. I do not have adequate words. I have warm, deep. The smell of something that was flour and water and became something else entirely. The yeast in it, the salt in it, the specific character of this rye flour from this supplier with this water from these pipes in this bakery in this neighborhood. All of it in the smell. Goldstein said, "Do you want a piece?" He did not wait for my answer. He cut a piece from the end of one loaf, the heel, the end piece, which is the baker's reward and the best part, and handed it to me. No butter, no knife, just the bread, still hot enough to steam when he cut it. I ate it. I am going to try to describe the taste. The crust first. Firm. The specific resistance of a good rye crust that is developed properly, that gives and then yields, that makes a sound. Not the crunch of bad bread, the specific clean crack of good crust meeting a tooth. The crust is not hard, it is structured. The difference matters. The inside, dense and moist in the way of good rye, which is not the airiness of white bread. Rye is heavier, more substantial, the crumb tighter, the texture more present. Not heavy in the way of something that hasn't risen properly, substantial in the way of something that is exactly what it is meant to be. The taste. Sour, a little, from the yeast. Not unpleasantly sour, the specific pleasant sourness that indicates the fermentation did what it was supposed to do, that the complex of organic acids that develop during the rise are present and contributing. Salt, and underneath both, the specific taste of the rye grain itself, which is darker and more complex than wheat, which has a flavor that white bread does not have. And heat. The bread was still hot. The specific quality of food eaten at the moment it comes from the oven, a quality that restaurants aspire to and rarely achieve, because the time between the oven and the plate is always longer than 0. The bread was at the exact temperature of just done. I ate the piece in perhaps 3 bites. I did not say anything. Goldstein had already turned back to the oven. Later, after the first batch was cooling, while the second batch was in the oven, while Moshe was doing something with a bowl of starter that I did not fully understand, Goldstein sat on a stool by the wall and said, "You want to know about the bread in Luge?" I did want to know. I hadn't asked. He knew. He described the bakery in Luge. His father's bakery, not his grandfather's. His grandfather's was before he could remember clearly. His father's bakery. Smaller than this one. Darker. The oven was different. A different kind of oven, he described it with his hands. The specific architecture of a Polish baking oven, which is different from the American one, which produces a different crust. The neighborhood. Jewish neighborhood. Łódź in the 1890s and 1900s when he was a boy, before the century turned bad. He described it briefly, as someone who does not have much to say that would make sense to someone who wasn't there. The specific sounds of the street, the languages, Yiddish, Polish, Russian, the specific smells. The bread. His father made challah for Shabbat. Not the everyday bread, the holiday bread, the braided egg bread that is the bread of the Sabbath, the bread that is made specifically to be beautiful and specific and different from the everyday. The challah in Łódź, he said, was the best bread I have ever eaten. I said, "Better than yours?" He looked at me. He said, "My father made it. I was 8 years old. It was Friday. Those are not things I can reproduce here." I want to say something about what Goldstein told me about the challah. My father made it. I was 8 years old. It was Friday. He can reproduce the recipe. He can reproduce the ingredients, the proportions, the process. He can make challah in New York that is technically correct, that uses the same flour-to-egg ratio, that is braided the same way and baked at the same temperature. He cannot reproduce his father. He cannot reproduce 8 years old. He cannot reproduce Friday in Łódź in 1895. The bread absorbs the context of its making. Not literally. The bread does not chemically retain the memory of the person who made it, or the specific day, or the specific kitchen. But our experience of food is so thoroughly entangled with the context of eating it that the context is part of the taste. The bread Goldstein's father made on Friday in Łódź tasted the way it tasted, partly because of the specific flour and the specific oven and the specific skill of a man who had been making challah for decades. And partly because it was his father. And partly because it was 8 years old. And partly because it was Friday, which meant something specific to a Jewish family in Łódź in 1895, the specific weekly rhythm of the Sabbath in a household organized around it. Those elements cannot travel. The recipe traveled, the knowledge traveled, the memory traveled. And memory, when it meets the bread in the mouth, does something the chemistry doesn't account for. I stayed until 8 o'clock. The shop opened at 7. The first hour of the shop open, I watched who came and what they said and what they bought. Mrs. Petrova, my neighbor, the woman who gave me the geranium, came at 7:15. She said something in Russian or Hungarian to Goldstein, and he said something back, and she took a specific loaf from the rack, the same loaf, and paid and left. They did not discuss the bread. The transaction was the negotiation of two people who know exactly what will happen before it happens. A young woman I didn't know, perhaps 20, came at 7:30. She looked at the rack. She asked what Goldstein recommended. He said, "The rye. Today's rye is good." She bought the rye. A man in a good suit came at 7:45. He said, "The usual." Goldstein gave him a white Pullman loaf, sandwich bread, the American bread, not the rye. The man left without looking at anything else. What I noticed, for most of the regular customers, the conversation with Goldstein was shorter than the conversation with anyone else in the morning. The transaction was efficient precisely because the knowledge was there. Goldstein knows what they want, they know what he has, the bread is the given. But the efficiency was not coldness. The woman who took the loaf at 7:15, Mrs. Petrova, the exchange with Goldstein had a warmth in it that I could hear even not understanding the language. Not the warmth of friends catching up. The warmth of two people who have been having the same small, reliable exchange for years, and who find in its repetition something they value. The bread is the occasion. The occasion produces the exchange. The exchange is the relationship. Twice a week, for however long they have both been on this block. I left at 8 o'clock with a loaf of bread under my arm, the rye, the one Goldstein handed me at the door when I said goodbye, without my asking and without my paying, which I tried to protest and which he dismissed with the specific gesture of someone for whom the protest is not interesting. I walked home on West 54th Street. The street at 8 in the morning, different from the street at 4. People. The specific morning population of someone walking to work, someone walking a dog, the delivery trucks unloading, the newsstand open with the morning papers. The city at full morning speed. I walked with the bread and I thought, the bread in my arm is the knowledge of Goldstein's father, which was the knowledge of Goldstein's grandfather, which is the accumulated knowledge of people making bread in Luch, who are now mostly gone, brought to West 54th Street in 1921 in the hands of one man, and making bread every morning since. The bread under my arm is 54 years of hands. The bread under my arm is Luch. And also West 54th Street. Because the bread has changed here, adjusted to the flour and the water and the oven and the 22 years of New York, and is now both things simultaneously. The bread that was made there and the bread that is made here. Both. I have been buying this bread for 3 years. I did not know what I was buying. I have been sitting at this table for an hour and a half, and I want to say what bread is. Not what it is in the abstract. What it is, having watched Goldstein make it at 4 in the morning, and having eaten the piece from the oven at 6:15, and having walked home with the loaf, and having had toast from it this morning with a cup of coffee in my kitchen. 01. Foof.